Hi, I'm Reverend Rodrigo Solano, the minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Olinda, and I'm here to bring the church closer to you. With Victoria Day coming up tomorrow, we have a major Canadian holiday in our sights. But there's another worldwide holiday that you might have missed last Friday. It was International Tea Day on May 21st. And this day isn't some self-proclaimed holiday by some random guy on the internet. It has the full backing of the United Nations General Assembly. Now, if you haven't heard about it, it might be because this was only the second year it's been implemented. And its purpose is to expand awareness about the global importance of sustainable tea agriculture around the world, recognizing that tea is a major economic source of livelihood for many, and it can be even more sustainable for our planet and the farmers if environmental and fair trade best practices take better hold, which is to say, if better standards are adopted. There's also a similar holiday of this sort in Japan on March 28th. It's a commemoration of a fellow named Senno Rikyu, who was a major influence in the development of the Japanese ceremony, the tea ceremony. Now, these ceremonies can have some very exacting standards for when, where, and how tea is prepared, served, and consumed. The standards matter, and they also shift. There are indeed many schools of the Japanese tea ceremony, and I suspect each of them was developed for its specific cultural setting. Many of us might not conform to those particular standards if it's not part of our culture. But every once in a while, we might bump into other standards for tea. In the case of ISO 3103, tea, preparation of liquor for use in sensory tests, the international standard is there for a specific purpose. It lays out very specific instructions on equipment, portions, and timing. But as Sam Wendover and Tom Scott point out in their videos about the International Standard Cup of Tea, those particular standards are there for the goal of ensuring that the preparation of tea is not a variable in experiments regarding flavor perception. It is an important standard for that specific purpose. Outside of that scope, the best cup of tea is the one that suits you best, as well as any company you might eventually have. Standards, however we defined and redefine them, help us navigate the fog of the future, offering us guidelines that can help ground us whenever what's next is uncertain. And they also require a degree of interpretation as situations shift. We continue to be in a time when it's increasingly obvious that the future isn't obvious. Over the past year, it has become increasingly clear that having clarity about the future is an imperfect science, and that even educated guesses are still guesses. As we read the proverbial tea leaves while we attempt to make sense of what's in store, we can nonetheless find comfort in the knowledge that, yes, there are guideposts along the way, which help us and our society move along with a hazy map, or at least a steady compass to point us through the haze. And in the coming months, we have some idea of what we expect our timelines to be for things like in-person gatherings and other things that we haven't been able to do for a while. When and how these things happen will depend on whether we meet certain standards, on things like vaccination rates and the feasibility of other safety protocols. We've talked about vaccines before, and how it was important for researchers and regulators to hold them to a high standard of safety and efficacy before they were made available to the public. At the same time, there was some flexibility in streamlining the clinical trial processes to reduce lag time and red tape. This was done while still keeping the core standards on safety and efficacy in mind. But standards can be deceptive. The published efficacy rates for our current approved vaccines have been quoted as ranging from 60 to 95% or thereabouts, giving the impression that some of the vaccines are substantially better than others. Epidemiologists have been quick to point out that the meaning of those numbers doesn't represent what we might think it represents. For starters, they measure slightly different things. In trials that were conducted in different places, at different times, and facing different variants. And there's a link in the description and the web's text of the service with a fuller explanation about this. But there's an entirely different matter at play. Those numbers also don't answer what are possibly more important questions. They relate to infection rates, but where the vaccines really shine is in preventing serious illness, hospitalization, and death. And using those metrics, those standards, all vaccines in Canada are virtually 100% effective. This, of course, is not medical advice from me. Your healthcare provider is a better resource. My friends, the standards matter. When you know what you use them for, who you use them for, when you use them for. In our Unitarian Universalist congregations, we are familiar with a number of standards. Perhaps the best known standard in our North American setting is the covenant to affirm and promote the 7 principles. These principles haven't always looked the way they do now. The first 6 of them were only adopted in 1960, and the 7th principle is the newest, adopted in 1984. You may have now heard that there's been talk of adopting an 8th principle to clarify our commitment to dismantle racism and other oppressions. In fact, some individual congregations have already adopted it, and our system of governance leaves room for that. Regardless of whether the Unitarian Universalist Association or the Canadian Unitarian Council have done so. The fact remains that even in the case of this well-known standard, we know that it has changed and that it can do so unevenly. You may have also heard that for a few brief days, it looked like the Canadian Unitarian Council, the CUC, had indeed adopted the 8th principle at its annual general meeting a couple weeks ago. As it turns out, the process that took place earlier this month did not meet the standard for that kind of decision to be formalized. But it did show that there is widespread enthusiasm for us to take bolder action in the coming months. This is more than a pedantic debate on technicalities. It is partly about following our denomination's legal commitments as a nonprofit, and perhaps more importantly, honoring more deeply our 5th principle promise in following a democratic process, another standard that we have set for ourselves, ensuring that our collective voices have been heard on the matter with appropriate deliberation, while also moving as swiftly as we can on this important matter. And one of the steps toward that goal is taking part in the kind of conversations that the CUC is hosting this coming Saturday and again later in June and other times. I also encourage you to read the CUC letter, A Way Forward for the 8th Principle Process, which will answer many of the questions you might have about this. It will also require a degree of flexibility, being open to embrace a degree of imperfection, and perhaps being willing to live with some degree of dissatisfaction if the precise wording of the new principle doesn't exactly match your preferred wording. In working toward a general consensus, not everyone will get everything they want, but we may work towards something that we are okay with and can support. There are other standards in our tradition. Ministers have a set of standards on conduct and professional expectations. How exactly those apply in specific circumstances can and has changed. But the fact that they are there guides us on our goal of offering the best service that we can under the circumstances. Our liturgies, the order of service in each individual congregation, can have many commonly recognized elements across the country and the continent. You can usually tell when you're at a Unitarian Universalist gathering. And we know that they are also different in each congregation. Sometimes orders of service are different within the same congregation, depending on the time and space in which we operate. The last few months have shown us that flexibility on how we gather and hold a Sunday service is important, even as we keep a general sense to guide us on what is important as we search for truth. My friends, in the coming months, new questions will be coming up. Questions on how we might continue to gather as circumstances change, quite possibly for the better. We will be exploring the feasibility of in-person gatherings, as well as how we might incorporate our new knowledge of how to offer multiple platforms to make our services accessible to our wider community. And of course, we'll be exploring questions on how our covenant will take place in the future, how it will develop in the future. My friends, the answers to these questions still remain somewhat enshrined in the fog of the future, but there will be some standards from our covenants, our principles, our values, and our practices to help guide us and point us in the direction that may best suit our communities. My friends, the standards might not always matter in the sense that we think they do, but they do matter. And perhaps the best standard and guideline that we have is our covenant, our promise to proceed in love. So may it be, in solidarity and love. Amen.